A rich man shows up at his ex's wedding with a homeless woman on his arm, and at first everyone thinks it's a stunt. But when she walks into the room, something else happens. A faded keepsake and a whispered name hint that her past is tied to the bride's family. The night flips from spectacle to secret. Tabloids roar, and suddenly one woman's story could expose a long-buried betrayal. Then she disappears, and people are left asking why. What happens when mercy collides with a secret that could ruin reputations? And can kindness undo what the past has already broken? The thick cream envelope arrived on Matthew's mahogany desk, like a ghost from the past. His name was written in flowing gold calligraphy across the front, but it was the return address that made his stomach clench. Even before opening it, he knew what lay inside. Matthew's fingers traced the edge of the envelope, remembering a time when such invitations brought joy rather than dread. With practiced control, he slid his letter opener beneath the flap and extracted the contents. The invitation was everything he expected: ornate, expensive, dripping with sophistication. Together with their families. It read, "Vivian Elizabeth Crawford and James Preston Montgomery request the honor of your presence." Matthew set it down and walked to the window of his office, 40 stories above the city streets. The late afternoon sun caught the glass buildings, turning them to mirrors of amber and gold. 3 years had passed since Vivian had ended their engagement, yet the prospect of watching her marry another man twisted something deep in his chest. "Mr. Hale." His assistant's voice came through the intercom. "Your 4 o'clock is here." "Thank you, Sarah. Give me 5 minutes." His voice remained steady, betraying none of the turmoil beneath. Years of boardroom negotiations had taught him that much at least. He straightened his tie in the reflection, adjusted his cuffs, and packed away the emotional response that threatened to crack his carefully maintained facade. There would be gossip, of course. The social circles they both inhabited thrived on it. He could already imagine the whispers at the ceremony, how the jilted ex-fiancée had shown up, how he still wasn't over her, how tragic it all was. The afternoon passed in a blur of meetings and conference calls, but the invitation sat like a weight in his thoughts. By evening, when the office had emptied and the city lights had begun to twinkle against the darkening sky, Matthew knew he needed to walk to clear his head. He loosened his tie and took the elevator down to the street. The autumn air held a crisp edge that helped clear away the cobwebs of the day. His feet carried him down familiar streets, past high-end boutiques and restaurants where he'd once dined with Vivian, now closing for the night. Without conscious thought, he found himself in a different part of the city, where the buildings were older and the streets less, polished. Here was the shelter he supported through his foundation, one of many charitable projects he preferred to manage quietly, without fanfare or press releases. Matthew slowed his pace as he approached. The shelter's windows glowed warmly in the gathering dusk, and through them he could see movement, people lining up for dinner, volunteers moving about with trays and supplies. That's when he first saw her. A woman with silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a neat bun was moving through the dining area with quiet purpose. She stopped to help an elderly man with his tray, spoke soft words to a young mother with 2 children, and somehow managed to diffuse a brewing argument between 2 other residents with nothing more than a gentle touch and a few quiet words. Matthew found himself pausing, watching through the window. There was something compelling about her presence, not flashy or demanding attention, but steady as a heartbeat. She wore simple clothes, clearly worn but clean and neat, and moved with a dignity that seemed to create a pocket of calm wherever she went. "That's Rosa," a voice said beside him, making him start slightly. One of the shelter's regular volunteers was taking out trash bags. "Rosa Alvarez. She's been staying with us for about 6 months now. Don't know what we'd do without her, honestly. She helps out more than some of our paid staff." Matthew nodded, not wanting to explain his presence or interest. But he continued to watch as Rosa organized the serving line, her movements efficient but never hurried. When a young man dropped his tray, sending food scattering across the floor, she was there in moments, not to scold but to help clean up, speaking words Matthew couldn't hear but could see calming the man's evident distress. The contrast between this scene and the wedding invitation sitting in his desk drawer struck him forcefully. Here was someone who had likely lost everything, yet moved through life with grace and purpose. No pretense, no social maneuvering, just quiet strength and genuine care for others. A small commotion drew his attention back to the scene inside. An older woman had become agitated, her voice rising as she gestured wildly with her cane. Rather than backing away, Rosa approached her directly, sat down beside her, and simply listened. Within minutes, the woman's shoulders had relaxed, and she was wiping her eyes with a napkin Rosa had provided. Matthew checked his watch, surprised to find he'd been standing there for nearly 20 minutes. The city had grown darker around him, the street lamps creating pools of light on the sidewalk. He should head home. There were emails to answer, documents to review, a life of privilege and responsibility waiting for his return. But something about Rosa Alvarez stayed with him as he turned away from the shelter's warmth and walked back through the increasingly chilly night. The way she carried herself, the quiet authority she wielded not through position or wealth, but through simple human kindness. It challenged him in ways he couldn't quite articulate. His phone buzzed with a message from his sister, probably asking about the wedding invitation she knew he must have received. Matthew ignored it for now. His thoughts were still in that humble dining room, watching a woman who had every reason to be broken by life, but instead chose to be a source of strength for others. The contrast between Rosa's world and the one he would encounter at Vivian's wedding couldn't have been starker. Yet somehow, standing outside that shelter had made him feel more grounded than he had all day. The wedding invitation that had seemed so important hours ago now felt less powerful, less able to shake his composure. Rosa knelt beside Mr. Jenkins' chair, her experienced hands gentle as she checked the bandage on his ankle. The elderly man had stumbled on the shelter's steps earlier that day, and though the scrape wasn't serious, she wanted to make sure infection wouldn't set in. "You've got healing hands, Miss Rosa," Mr. Jenkins said, his weathered face crinkling into a smile. "Just like my wife had. She was a nurse too, you know." Rosa's fingers paused briefly as she secured the fresh gauze. "I haven't practiced nursing in quite a while, Mr. Jenkins." She kept her voice light, though something flickered in her dark eyes. "But some skills, they stay with you." From across the room, another resident called out, "Rosa, could you look at my shoulder again? It's acting up something fierce." "In a moment, Mrs. Chen," Rosa responded, finishing with Mr. Jenkins' bandage. As she stood, her knees protesting slightly, she caught sight of a familiar face in the doorway, the well-dressed man who'd been watching through the window the night before. But there was work to be done. Rosa moved to Mrs. Chen's table, where the elderly woman was rotating her shoulder with a grimace. As she began to gently manipulate the joint, using techniques learned long ago in physical therapy rounds, her mind drifted back to the hospital corridors she'd once walked. "I learned this when I worked at Mercy General," she explained to Mrs. Chen, demonstrating a stretching technique. "Before the factory collapse." The words slipped out before she could catch them, and she felt the familiar tightness in her chest. Mrs. Chen patted her hand. "You lost someone there?" Rosa nodded, focusing on the shoulder movement. "My brother. He was working overtime that night. After that..." She trailed off, then managed a small smile. "Well, one thing led to another. I took time off to care for our mother. She never really recovered from the shock. Then she passed, and the medical bills..." She shrugged, the gesture containing years of accumulated loss. From the doorway, Matthew stood very still, his expensive coat feeling suddenly heavy on his shoulders. He'd come back telling himself it was mere curiosity, a need to understand why this place, and this woman had occupied his thoughts all day. But watching her move from person to person, offering not just medical care but dignity and connection, he felt something shift in his perspective. Rosa was helping a young man with a persistent cough now, and Matthew could hear her patient questioning. "How long have you had this? Are you taking the antibiotics from the clinic? Make sure you finish the whole course this time, Joey, even if you start feeling better." Her voice carried the authority of professional training, but there was something more, a compassion that hadn't been beaten out of her, despite everything she'd lost. Matthew found himself thinking of the wedding invitation again, but this time with a different kind of clarity. Before he could second-guess himself, he stepped fully into the room. Several heads turned, but Rosa remained focused on her task, writing down instructions for Joey about rest and fluid intake. "Ms. Alvarez?" His voice came out more formal than he'd intended. She looked up, recognition flickering in her eyes. "Yes. I'm Matthew Hale." He moved closer, aware of the curious glances from others in the room. "I was wondering if I might have a moment of your time." Rosa straightened, brushing her hands on her worn jeans. "Of course." She led him to a quieter corner of the room, her manner professional despite the unusual situation. Matthew found himself speaking before he'd fully formed the thoughts. "I have a rather unexpected proposition for you." He paused, suddenly aware of how this might sound. "That is, I'm attending a wedding next month, my ex-fiancée's wedding, to be precise, and I find myself in need of a date." Rosa's eyebrows rose slightly, but she remained silent, waiting. "I know this must sound strange," he continued, "but watching you these past 2 evenings, the way you handle difficult situations with such grace." He took a breath. "Would you consider accompanying me to this wedding? As my guest? I would, of course, provide everything needed, attire, transportation, whatever you require." The words hung in the air between them. Rosa's expression was unreadable, but her eyes were sharp, assessing. When she spoke, her voice was careful. "Mr. Hale, while I appreciate the offer, I have to wonder why you would ask someone you've never even spoken to before tonight to attend such a personal event." "Because you're real," he said, the words surprising even him with their honesty. "In a world of careful social maneuvering and practiced smiles, you're genuinely helping people. No agenda, no networking, no social climbing. Just—" He gestured to the room around them. "This." Rosa looked around at the shelter's dining area, at the people she'd come to know over the past months. When she turned back to Matthew, there was a hint of something like amusement in her eyes. "You realize this sounds like the plot of a movie? The wealthy businessman asking the homeless woman to be his date?" Matthew felt his face warm slightly. "I suppose it does, but I'm not asking for a performance or a pretense. Just be yourself. That's actually exactly what I need." He watched as she considered his words, her fingers absently smoothing a wrinkle in her shirt. In that gesture, he saw both the nurse she had been and the woman she was now, someone who had lost everything but her essential self. "When is this wedding?" she asked finally. 4 weeks from Saturday at the Metropolitan Garden Hotel." Rosa's eyes widened slightly at the venue name, but she didn't comment on it. Instead, she said, "I would need to make sure someone could cover my volunteer shifts here." "Of course," Matthew said quickly, hope rising in his chest. "Is that a yes?" Rosa looked at him for a long moment, and he had the distinct feeling he was being evaluated by criteria he couldn't quite understand. Finally, she nodded. "Yes, Mr. Hale, I'll accompany you to your ex-fiancée's wedding. Though I have to say this might be the strangest thing I've agreed to in quite a while." A genuine smile spread across Matthew's face, the first one he'd felt since receiving that gilded invitation. "Thank you, Ms. Alvarez. I think this might work out better than either of us expects." Rosa shook her head slowly, her practical nature wrestling with the surreal situation. "Mr. Hale, while I appreciate the gesture, I really don't think—" "Please," Matthew interrupted, his voice gentler than before. "Call me Matthew." She studied him carefully, noting the expensive cut of his suit that somehow didn't match the warmth in his eyes. "Matthew, then. I have to ask, why really? There must be dozens of society women who jump at the chance." A shadow crossed his face. "That's exactly why I'm asking you. Those women, they'd see it as an opportunity, a chance to get their hooks in." He ran a hand through his hair, messing up its perfect arrangement. "But you see people. Really see them." Mrs. Chen, one of the regular volunteers, walked past with a stack of plates, trying hard to look like she wasn't listening. Rosa noticed several others casting curious glances their way. "I've watched how you work here," Matthew continued, leaning against the wall. "You treat everyone with dignity. No judgment, no pity, just respect. That's rare." Rosa felt her cheeks warm. "It's just basic human decency." "No," Matthew said firmly. "It's extraordinary. And that's exactly what I need at this wedding. Someone real. Someone who won't play games or try to score points off other people's pain." The evening bustle of the shelter continued around them. The clatter of dishes, murmured conversations, the squeak of chairs on linoleum. Rosa found herself remembering her nursing days, how she'd learned to read people quickly, to spot the difference between what they said and what they needed. "Mrs. Rodriguez?" called Joey from across the room. "My head's feeling worse." "Just a moment," Rosa replied, automatically, then turned back to Matthew. "I should check on him." "Of course." Matthew stepped aside, but didn't leave. Instead, he watched as she went to Joey's table, felt his forehead, and spoke to him quietly. When she returned, there was a hint of admiration in his expression that made her uncomfortable in its sincerity. "See, that right there," he said. "You don't stop being who you are, no matter the circumstances." Linda, another shelter regular, approached hesitantly. "Everything okay, Rosa?" "Yes, Linda, thank you." Rosa smiled reassuringly, aware of the protective concern in the older woman's eyes. Once Linda moved away, Matthew spoke again, his voice taking on a playful edge that seemed to surprise even him. "Think of it as an anthropological study. You can observe how the other half lives, report back to everyone here about all our ridiculous customs." A reluctant laugh escaped her. "Now you're just trying to make this sound like an adventure instead of what it really is." "And what's that?" "A complicated situation that could go wrong in about 100 different ways." Matthew's expression sobered. "You're probably right. But maybe—" He paused, choosing his words carefully. "Maybe it could also be a chance to be seen for who you are, not just your circumstances. To remind certain people that worth isn't measured by bank accounts or social standing." Rosa felt something shift inside her at those words. She looked around the shelter, at the familiar faces, the worn furniture, the makeshift home they'd created here. "The volunteers would need to cover my shifts." "I'll make a donation to help with staffing," Matthew offered quickly, then added, "Not as payment for your company, just because it's the right thing to do." Mrs. Chen passed by again, this time not even pretending not to listen. She gave Rosa an encouraging nod. "There would be logistics to consider," Rosa said slowly. "I don't exactly have a suitable wardrobe for a society wedding." "All taken care of," Matthew assured her. "Whatever you need. No strings attached." Rosa raised an eyebrow. Everything comes with strings, Mr. Hale. Matthew. He corrected again, then smiled. And you're right. I suppose my string is wanting someone genuine in my corner, while I face a room full of people who think they know exactly who I am. The honesty in his voice struck her. She recognized something in him then, a loneliness carefully hidden behind wealth and control, not so different from the loneliness she saw every day in the shelter. Well, she said finally, I suppose it would be interesting to see how the other half lives, as you put it. Matthew's face lit up with genuine pleasure. Is that a yes? It's a I must be crazy, but yes. She held up a hand as he started to speak. But I have conditions. I won't pretend to be someone I'm not. And I won't be part of any scheme to make your ex-fiancée jealous. Agreed, on both counts. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. My direct number. We can work out the details over the next few days. As Matthew left the shelter, Rosa could feel the buzz of excitement and concern spreading through the room. Mrs. Chen hurried over immediately. Rosa, are you sure about this? She asked, wringing her hands. That man is Matthew Hale. He's in the papers all the time. I know, Mrs. Chen. Rosa tucked the business card carefully into her pocket. But sometimes the most unexpected choices turn out to be exactly right. Linda joined them, shaking her head. It's like a fairy tale, she declared. Our Rosa going to a fancy society wedding? It's just one evening, Rosa reminded them, but she couldn't help smiling at their excitement. And I'm going as myself, not some made-over princess. Still, Mrs. Chen insisted, it's quite something. Just be careful, dear. Rosa nodded, touching the card in her pocket. I will be. But you know what? I think he might be the one who needs to be careful. Society events can be sharks' ponds. And you'll be the lifeboat, Linda said firmly. Just like you are for all of us. Rosa smoothed down the simple navy dress Matthew had helped her select. Though elegant, it was understated enough to make her feel like herself. The charity gathering buzzed with conversation and tinkling crystal in one of the city's most exclusive venues, a converted historical mansion with soaring ceilings and gilt-edged mirrors. She stood near a marble column, taking in the scene. Matthew had been pulled away by some business associates, leaving her to observe the glittering crowd. Ladies in designer dresses air-kissed each other's cheeks, while waiters circulated with champagne and delicate hors d'oeuvres. Would you like something to drink, ma'am? A server paused beside her. Just water, thank you. Rosa accepted the crystal glass, using it as a prop to feel less conspicuous. Her eyes drifted across the room, taking in the details. The decor was immaculate, fresh flowers everywhere, ice sculptures catching the light, and elaborate table settings that probably cost more than most shelter residents saw in a month. The main table, reserved for the host family, drew her attention with its particularly ornate arrangement. That's when she saw it. Rosa's hand trembled slightly, causing ripples in her water. There, embossed on a silver centerpiece, was a distinctive crest, a rising phoenix surrounded by intertwined roses. Her free hand unconsciously went to her neck, where beneath her dress hung a small silver pendant on a worn chain. The pendant had been her mother's most treasured possession, passed down through generations. Rosa had never known its origin story, only that her mother had guarded it fiercely, even in their hardest times. The matching crests couldn't be a coincidence. I see you're admiring our family emblem. The voice behind her was cultured, elegant. Rosa turned to find an older woman studying her with keen interest. Her silver-streaked hair was perfectly styled, her posture regal. I'm Eleanor Bradford, Vivian's mother. Rosa Alvarez, she managed, extending her hand. Thank you for including me in your celebration. Alvarez. Eleanor's perfectly shaped eyebrows drew together. That's interesting. You remind me of someone I knew long ago. She tilted her head, examining Rosa's features more closely. A dear friend named Carmen. The room seemed to tilt slightly. Carmen, her mother's name. Rosa's fingers clutched her water glass tighter. Carmen Alvarez? Eleanor's voice had dropped to nearly a whisper. Rosa couldn't find her voice for a moment. When she did, it came out barely audible. She was my mother. Eleanor Bradford's face went ash white. She reached out to steady herself against a nearby chair. "Oh my God!" she breathed. "You're Carmen's daughter." The elegant woman's reaction confirmed what Rosa was beginning to suspect. There was far more to her mother's story than she'd ever known. The pendant around her neck suddenly felt heavy with unspoken history. "Perhaps we should sit down," Eleanor suggested, gesturing to a quiet corner with a small settee. Rosa followed, her legs feeling unsteady. They had just settled when Vivian appeared, looking like a magazine cover in her designer dress. "Mother, the photographers want to—" She trailed off, noting Eleanor's pallor. "Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine, darling," Eleanor said smoothly, though her hands were clasped tightly in her lap. "Just catching up with Matthew's guest." Vivian's eyes swept over Rosa with barely concealed disdain before she nodded and moved away. But Rosa barely noticed, her attention fixed on Eleanor Bradford's trembling hands and the way the older woman kept staring at her, as if seeing a ghost. "Your mother," Eleanor began, then stopped. "How is Carmen?" "She passed away 5 years ago," Rosa said quietly. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. "I'm so sorry. I lost touch with her so many years ago. After everything that happened." She reached out as if to touch Rosa's hand, then pulled back. "You have her eyes, you know. I should have seen it immediately." Rosa's heart was pounding. "Mrs. Bradford, what exactly happened? My mother never spoke about her past, but this crest—" She touched her pendant through her dress. Eleanor's eyes widened at the gesture. "You have one of the pendants?" Her voice was strained. "Of course you do. Carmen would have wanted you to have it." Before she could continue, a man in an expensive suit approached. "Eleanor, the mayor's waiting to discuss the foundation's new initiative." "Of course, Richard, I'll be right there." Eleanor stood, but her eyes stayed fixed on Rosa. "We need to talk, properly talk. But not here, not now. There's too much." She pressed her lips together. "Would you be willing to meet with me? After the wedding, perhaps?" Rosa nodded, her mind whirling with questions. "Please." Eleanor touched her arm briefly. "Don't mention this conversation to anyone, not even Matthew. There are complications I need to sort through first." As Eleanor glided away to join her waiting guests, Rosa sat frozen in place. What had started as a simple arrangement with Matthew had suddenly become infinitely more complex. Her mother's pendant felt like it was burning against her skin, heavy with secrets that were starting to unravel. Matthew found her a few minutes later, still sitting in the corner. "There you are. I'm sorry I got pulled away. Are you okay? You look pale." Rosa forced a smile. "I'm fine. Just a little overwhelmed by all of this." She gestured vaguely at the opulent room, but her mind was on Eleanor Bradford's face when she'd heard Carmen's name, and the matching crests that somehow linked her simple mother to this world of wealth and privilege. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and bright. Rosa stood in front of a borrowed mirror, smoothing down the simple navy dress she'd found at a consignment shop. It was elegant in its simplicity, clean lines, classic cut, and a hem that fell just below her knees. She'd spent an evening carefully steaming out the wrinkles and sewing a loose button more securely. Matthew's car pulled up outside her temporary housing exactly at 9 o'clock. He stepped out, looking handsome in his dark suit, and opened the passenger door for her. "You look lovely," he said quietly, and Rosa could tell he meant it. The drive to the church was mostly silent. Rosa watched the city scroll past her window, noting how the buildings grew more impressive as they entered the wealthy district. Her hands kept straying to her mother's pendant, now tucked safely beneath her dress. They arrived at St. Michael's Cathedral, all soaring stone and stained glass. Matthew helped her from the car, and Rosa felt the first flutter of nerves as they approached the entrance. Several guests were already gathered outside, their designer outfits and jewelry catching the morning sun. The whispers started immediately. Rosa could feel the stares, hear the hushed conversations falling silent as she passed. A woman in an elaborate hat turned to her companion and muttered something behind her hand. "Ignore them," Matthew said under his breath, but Rosa hadn't survived years of hardship by caring what privileged people thought of her. She held her head high as they entered the cathedral's vast interior. The sanctuary was a symphony of white flowers and ribbon, with sunlight streaming through the ancient windows. More guests filled the pews, and the ripple of gossip followed their progress down the aisle. Rosa caught fragments of whispered conversations. "Can't believe he brought... Where did he find... What was he thinking?" They found seats near the middle, and Rosa was grateful for the moment to catch her breath. But then she heard a small sound of distress from the pew behind them. She turned to see a little girl, perhaps 6 years old, in a frilly flower girl dress. The child was fighting tears as her mother frantically tried to fix a torn ribbon on her basket. "Here," Rosa said softly, reaching into her small purse. "I always carry safety pins." She smiled at the little girl. "May I help?" The child nodded, sniffling. With gentle efficiency, Rosa secured the ribbon, then produced a tissue and dried the girl's tears. "There now, you look beautiful, like a princess." The girl's face brightened. "Really? Really?" Rosa assured her. "And princesses are brave, aren't they? They hold their heads high and do their very important jobs, even when they're nervous." The child sat up straighter, clutching her repaired basket. Her mother gave Rosa a grateful look, previous judgment forgotten in the face of such simple kindness. A commotion near the side chapel drew Rosa's attention. A young woman in a bridesmaid's dress was having what appeared to be a panic attack, her breathing rapid as she pressed herself against the wall. "Excuse me," Rosa murmured to Matthew, rising quietly. She approached the young woman, whose name tag identified her as part of the wedding coordination team. "Can't," the bridesmaid gasped. "Too many people. Everything has to be perfect. Look at me," Rosa said in the calm, firm voice she'd used countless times with patience. "That's right. Now, we're going to breathe together. In through your nose, out through your mouth." She demonstrated, and the young woman followed her lead. "Good. Again. In and out." Several people had stopped to watch, but Rosa kept her focus entirely on the bridesmaid. "Tell me your name." "Sarah," the young woman managed. "Okay, Sarah, you're doing great. Keep breathing with me. Now, what's the first thing you need to do next?" Check the bride's room. Make sure everything's ready." "That's perfect. We'll focus on just that one task. Would you like me to walk with you?" Sarah nodded gratefully. As they walked toward the bride's room, Rosa kept her talking about simple things, her favorite coffee shop, her cat at home. By the time they reached their destination, Sarah's breathing had normalized and her hands had stopped shaking. "Thank you," she said. "I don't know what happened. It was just suddenly all too much." "It's a big day with a lot of pressure," Rosa said. "But you're doing fine. One task at a time." As Rosa made her way back to her seat, she noticed the atmosphere around her had shifted. The sneers and whispers had largely given way to thoughtful looks and quiet conversations. A few people even smiled at her as she passed. Matthew was watching her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "You never stop helping people, do you?" he asked softly. Rosa settled back into her seat. "It's not about helping. It's about being human." The cathedral was nearly full now. The organist began playing soft preliminary music, and the wedding coordinator was directing the last guests to their seats. Rosa noticed Eleanor, Bradford in the front pew, resplendent in pale blue silk. The older woman caught her eye for a moment, and Rosa saw that same flash of recognition and unease before Eleanor quickly looked away. The little flower girl from earlier walked past their pew, head held high, her basket perfectly steady in her small hands. She gave Rosa a tiny, secret wave as she passed. "Who are you, Rosa Alvarez?" Matthew murmured, so quietly she wasn't sure she was meant to hear. She thought about her mother's pendant, about Eleanor Bradford's reaction, about all the twists and turns that had led her to this moment. "I'm just someone trying to make it through each day with grace," she answered simply. The organ music swelled, and the congregation rose as the first notes of the wedding march began to play. The wedding ceremony passed in a blur of music and flowers, and now the reception hall buzzed with the controlled chaos of photographers arranging group shots. Rosa stood to the side, watching as Vivian, radiant in her designer gown, directed the proceedings with practiced grace. "The Bradford family, please," the photographer called out. "And then we'll do the receiving line." Matthew touched Rosa's elbow. "Are you all right?" "Of course," she said, though her heart was beating faster as the receiving line began to form. Soon they would be face to face with Vivian, and Rosa wasn't sure what to expect. The line moved slowly. When they finally reached the front, Vivian's smile remained perfectly fixed, but Rosa noticed her fingers tightening on her new husband's arm. "Matthew," Vivian said, her voice carrying just the right note of warmth for old friends. "I'm so pleased you could come." Her gaze shifted to Rosa, and something flickered in her eyes, recognition, confusion, and what might have been fear. "And this must be your friend." "Rosa Alvarez," Rosa supplied quietly, extending her hand. Vivian took it with the briefest touch possible. "How interesting. I don't believe we've met before, have we?" "No," Rosa said simply. "But congratulations on your wedding. The ceremony was beautiful." "Thank you." Vivian's smile remained, but her face had gone slightly pale. "Matthew, might I have a word with you, in private?" Matthew's jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Of course. Rosa, would you mind?" "Not at all," Rosa said, stepping away. She watched as Vivian led Matthew to a small anteroom off the main hall, closing the door behind them. Inside, Vivian rounded on Matthew. "What kind of game are you playing?" "Game?" Matthew's voice was quiet but held an edge. "I brought a date to your wedding. Isn't that what the invitation suggested?" "Don't be obtuse." Vivian paced the small room. "You know exactly what I mean. Where did you find her? Why does it matter where I met Rosa?" "It matters because—" Vivian stopped, pressing her fingers to her temples. "You have no idea what you're doing. Then enlighten me." Matthew stepped closer. "What exactly am I doing? Vivian! Besides attending my ex-fiancée's wedding with a kind, intelligent woman who happens to be currently homeless." Vivian flinched at the word homeless. "Is that what this is about? Some sort of statement about charity? About how much you've grown since we ended things?" "Since you ended things, you mean?" The words hung between them, heavy with years of unspoken pain. "You never did tell me the real reason why. I told you we wanted different things." "No." Matthew's voice was firm. "That's what you said, but it wasn't the truth. You were scared of something, Vivian. You still are. I can see it in your face every time you look at Rosa." Vivian turned away, her shoulders tense. You don't know what you're talking about. Then tell me, after all these years, don't you think I deserve the truth? The truth. Vivian laughed, but it was a brittle sound. The truth is that you were too good, Matthew, too moral, too concerned with doing the right thing. And I knew that if we married, you would eventually start asking questions about my family, about the factory, about all the things we never discuss in polite company. The factory. Matthew frowned. You mean the one that collapsed? That was a tragedy, but it was years ago. Yes, it was. Vivian's voice was barely above a whisper. And some tragedies leave marks that never fade. She straightened her shoulders, composing herself. But this is my wedding day, and I won't have it ruined by old ghosts. Ghosts? Matthew studied her face. Or people who are very much alive. Vivian's hand trembled as she smoothed her dress. I need to get back to my guests. This conversation is over. Is it? Matthew caught her arm as she reached for the door. What aren't you telling me, Vivian? What are you so afraid of? For a moment, something cracked in Vivian's perfect facade. She looked suddenly younger, vulnerable in a way Matthew hadn't seen since they were first dating. There are things you don't understand, Matthew. Things that happened. Decisions that were made. By whom? Your parents? You? Please, Vivian whispered. Let it go. For both our sakes. Both our sakes, or for the sake of your family's reputation? Vivian pulled away from him. You always did think the worst of us. No, Matthew said quietly. I always thought you were better than the choices you were making. I still do. Then you were wrong. Vivian's mask slipped back into place. Now, if you'll excuse me, my husband is waiting. She opened the door and stepped out, immediately assuming the radiant smile of a happy bride. But Matthew had seen the fear in her eyes, the weight of whatever secret she carried. He watched her rejoin the reception, accepting congratulations and posing for photos, while beneath it all, something untold threatened to unravel. Rosa appeared at his side, her face concerned. Are you all right? Matthew looked at her, then back at Vivian. I'm not sure, but I think there's more to this story than either of us knew. There usually is, Rosa said softly, her hand unconsciously touching the pendant hidden beneath her dress. The reception continued around them, a swirl of celebration and champagne, but Matthew couldn't shake the feeling that beneath the perfect surface, years of carefully maintained silence were beginning to crack. Matthew found Rosa standing in a quiet hallway, away from the reception's bright lights and laughter. She was staring at an old photograph on the wall, a group shot of men in suits shaking hands outside an industrial building. Are you hiding too? He asked softly, coming to stand beside her. Rosa didn't turn. Her fingers were wrapped tightly around the pendant at her neck. That's my father, she said, pointing to a figure in the background of the photo. Hector Alvarez. He was the production manager. Matthew stepped closer, studying the image. A younger man stood slightly apart from the main group, his posture proud, but his expression guarded. Even in the faded photograph, there was something dignified about him. The Prescott Steel Mill, Rosa continued, her voice barely above a whisper. That photo was taken the day they announced the partnership. Everyone was so hopeful then. Matthew's chest tightened as pieces began falling into place. The mill that closed. Without warning. Rosa's hand trembled slightly as she touched the glass covering the photo. 300 workers lost their jobs overnight. Families that had been there for generations, suddenly with nothing. My father. She paused, drawing a shaky breath. He'd given 25 years to that place, put me through nursing school with his savings, and then one morning the gates were locked. No severance, no explanation. Just corporate lawyers talking about market forces and necessary restructuring. Matthew watched her face in the dim light. And the Prescotts, Vivian's family. They'd promised to modernize, to keep it running. A flash of old anger crossed Rosa's features. Instead, they stripped the assets and sold the land. My father found out later they'd planned it that way from the start. The partnership was just for show, to keep everyone quiet until the deal was done. Rosa. Matthew's voice was gentle. Why did you agree to come here today? She finally turned to face him, and he saw tears gleaming in her eyes. Because I needed to know if they remembered, if they ever thought about the lives they destroyed. She pulled the pendant from beneath her dress, a small silver medallion with a familiar crest. This was my mother's. She cleaned houses for the Prescotts when times were hard. Mrs. Prescott gave it to her, said it was a family heirloom, called her Dear Maria, and promised to help find work for my father. But they never did. No. Rosa's laugh was bitter. They moved away that summer. Mother died the next winter, pneumonia, because we couldn't afford proper heating. Father never recovered from losing her. The shame of not being able to provide, it broke something in him. He drinks too much now, lives with my cousin in Arizona. I haven't seen him in years. Matthew reached out, gently touching her arm. I'm so sorry. I'm not telling you this for sympathy. Rosa straightened her shoulders. I came because I wanted them to see me, not as some charity case or social experiment, but as Rosa Alvarez, daughter of Hector Alvarez. I wanted them to look me in the eye and remember what their wealth cost others. Does Vivian know about your connection to the mill? Her mother recognized my name at the charity event, the way she looked at me. Rosa shook her head. She knows. They all probably know. That's why they're so unsettled by my presence here. I'm a ghost they thought they'd buried along with their conscience. Matthew ran a hand through his hair, understanding dawning. That's why Vivian was so agitated. Why she ended our engagement. She must have known what her family had done. The truth has a way of surfacing, Rosa said quietly, no matter how deeply we try to bury it. A burst of laughter echoed from the reception hall. The sound felt jarring against the weight of Rosa's revelations. I should never have asked you to come, Matthew said. I had no idea I was reopening old wounds. You didn't reopen anything. These wounds never really healed. Rosa touched the photograph one last time. But maybe it's time they did. Not through forgetting, but through facing what happened. Through acknowledging the cost of choices made in boardrooms that shatter lives in living rooms. Matthew studied her face, the quiet strength, the dignity that had first drawn him to her at the shelter. What do you want to do? Nothing. She smiled sadly. I didn't come for revenge or confrontation. I just wanted to stand here, in this house, wearing this dress, and know that I survived. That we survived even if we lost everything. Sometimes being seen is enough. The corridor fell silent as they stood together, the party's distant music a muffled reminder of the celebration continuing without them. The old photograph hung between them, a frozen moment of handshakes and promises that would soon be broken, while in the present, two people from vastly different worlds found understanding in the quiet shadows of a wedding day. Rosa finally tucked the pendant back beneath her dress, its weight familiar against her heart. We should return to the reception. People will talk. Let them, Matthew said softly. Some things are worth talking about. Matthew's mother cornered him by the elaborate ice sculpture, her pearls gleaming as brightly as her displeasure. What were you thinking, bringing her here? She whispered, her voice sharp despite her polite smile. The board members are watching, Matthew. Everything you do reflects on the company. Matthew fought the urge to loosen his tie. The weight of expectations felt heavier than usual in the ornate ballroom. "Mother, please. Rosa is my guest. She's from a homeless shelter." His mother's words carried that familiar edge of disappointment. "And now I hear whispers about some connection to the Prescott factory scandal. Do you have any idea what this could do to our relationships? To our standing?" Across the room, Rosa stood alone near a window, her fingers fidgeting with the hem of her dress. Matthew could see the board members huddled in small groups, their glances anything but subtle. Richard Thompson, the eldest board member, was shaking his head while speaking in hushed tones to others. "The timing couldn't be worse," his mother continued. "With the merger negotiations next month, there are more important things than mergers." Matthew interrupted, though his stomach tightened at the thought of the potential fallout. "Don't be naive. You've worked too hard to risk everything on some social experiment." Before Matthew could respond, Harold Pierce, another board member, approached with a tight smile. "Matthew, might I have a word? In private." Rosa watched this exchange from her quiet corner, feeling increasingly like a pawn in a game she hadn't meant to play. The elegant surroundings that had seemed magical earlier now felt suffocating. She noticed the whispers, the sidelong glances, the way conversations stopped when she walked past. "You look like you could use this," a gentle voice said. An elderly woman held out a glass of water, her smile kind and genuine. "I'm Margaret Wilson. I used to be a nurse at County General." Rosa accepted the water gratefully. "I was a nurse too before life took an unexpected turn." Margaret's eyes held no judgment. "I remember reading about the factory closure. Treated some of those families myself. It wasn't right, what happened." Tears pricked at Rosa's eyes. "I should go. I'm only making things worse by being here." "Nonsense." Another voice joined in. A distinguished-looking man in his 60s stepped forward. "I'm James Wilson, Margaret's husband, former labor rights attorney." He gave Rosa a knowing look. Sometimes discomfort is necessary for change. Across the room, Matthew was enduring Harold Pierce's thinly veiled warnings about public image and shareholder confidence. His mother stood nearby, nodding in agreement, while other board members drifted closer to listen. "The shelter project is one thing," Harold was saying. "Admirable work, really. But this display, it raises questions about your judgment." Rosa watched Matthew's jaw tighten, saw the strain in his shoulders. She hadn't asked for this role in his world's drama. Perhaps it would be easier to slip away quietly, return to the familiar safety of the shelter, where at least she knew who she was. But then she felt Margaret's gentle hand on her arm. "You know, dear, I was at that charity event last week. Saw how you helped that overwhelmed young server when she dropped her tray. No one else even moved to assist, but you didn't hesitate. That's just what anyone would do," Rosa murmured. "No," James said firmly. "It's what someone with true character does. This room could use more of that, not less." A young woman in an expensive dress approached their small group. "Excuse me," she said hesitantly. "Are you Rosa Alvarez? My grandfather worked at the factory. He always spoke highly of your father." Rosa's heart clenched. "You're Carmen's granddaughter, little Sophie?" The woman's eyes lit up. "Yes, I can't believe you remember. I was just a child, but I never forgot how your family helped us after the closure. My grandfather said your father gave him his last savings to help us move to find work." More guests drifted closer, drawn by the conversation. Rosa saw Matthew watching from across the room, concern evident in his expression. She straightened her shoulders, drawing strength from the unexpected allies around her. "Your father was a good man," another older guest said. "The whole situation was a disgrace. Some of us never forgot." Margaret squeezed Rosa's hand. "Perhaps that's why you're really here today. Not as anyone's weapon or statement, but as a reminder that humanity matters more than headlines." The whispers continued among the board members, but now Rosa let them wash over her like distant waves. She thought of the shelter, of the dignity she tried to preserve there for others who had lost everything but their essential humanity. She thought of her father, who had lost his pride, but never his integrity. James Wilson's voice was quiet but firm. "Stay, Ms. Alvarez. Some stories need to be remembered, even at fancy weddings, especially at fancy weddings." Matthew finally extracted himself from the board members and made his way to Rosa's side. "I'm so sorry," he murmured. "I never meant to put you in this position." Rosa looked at the small group that had gathered around her. Margaret with her nurse's compassion, James with his fighter's spirit, young Sophie with her grateful memories. She thought of the photograph in the hallway, of all the lives changed by decisions made in distant boardrooms. "I'm not leaving," she said softly. "Not because of you or them or anyone else. I'm staying because some truths deserve to be faced in the light." The evening light slanted through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the reception hall. Rosa's fingers trembled slightly as she reached into her small clutch purse, retrieving 2 carefully preserved documents that she'd carried with her for years. The papers were worn at the edges, softened by time and handling, but the words on them remained clear enough to read. Margaret Wilson leaned closer, her earlier kindness giving Rosa the courage she needed. "What are those, dear?" "Evidence," Rosa said quietly, "of what really happened." She smoothed the first document, a ledger page from the factory's final month. The neat columns of numbers told a story that contradicted the official narrative of inevitable closure. Matthew stood at her shoulder, his presence steady. "May I?" Rosa handed him the ledger page. His eyes widened as he scanned the figures. "These numbers. The factory was still viable. There was enough capital to keep it running, yes." Rosa finished. But someone chose not to. She unfolded the second paper. A hospital note dated 3 days before the closure announcement. "This is from Dr. Elizabeth Chen. She was treating my father for stress-related symptoms when this arrived." The hospital note was brief but devastating. Patient presence with severe anxiety following meeting with Prescott Corp representative. Claims verbal agreement for bridge funding was rescinded without explanation. Recommendations for follow-up care. A sharp intake of breath drew their attention. Vivian stood frozen several feet away, her wedding dress rustling softly as she swayed. "Where did you get those?" "My father kept everything," Rosa said, her voice gentle despite the weight of the moment. Including the letter promising temporary support while the workers found new positions. It was signed by Thomas Prescott. The name hung in the air like smoke. Thomas Prescott, Vivian's father, had passed away 2 years ago, but his decisions lived on in the lives he'd altered. Vivian's carefully maintained composure cracked. "I remember that week," she whispered. "Father was unusually agitated. He spent hours in his study with the phone off the hook. Mother said we weren't to disturb him." James Wilson studied the ledger with professional interest. "The numbers align with what we suspected at the time, but could never prove. The closure wasn't necessary, it was expedient." More guests gathered, drawn by the quiet intensity of the conversation. Rosa noticed several older couples exchanging knowing looks. The story had been buried, but not forgotten. "There was a choice," Rosa continued, her words measured and clear. "The factory could have been saved. 300 families could have kept their dignity, their homes, their community. Instead, my father chose the cleaner option." Vivian finished. Her face had gone pale, but something like relief flickered in her eyes. I always wondered why he refused to discuss it, why he donated so generously to job training programs afterward. He was trying to wash away his guilt. Matthew touched the hospital note gently. Dr. Chen, I remember her. She tried to organize emergency medical support for the displaced workers, but the funding was blocked. By the hospital board. Rosa nodded. Your mother sits on that board, doesn't she? Matthew's mother had drifted closer during the exchange. Now she stepped forward, her elegant posture unable to hide her discomfort. We were told it would encourage dependency, she said softly, that it was better to make a clean break. The documents passed from hand to hand. Rosa watched as each person confronted the reality they represented. Not just numbers and dates, but human lives treated as abstract problems to be solved. My father died believing he had failed his workers, Rosa said. He never knew that the system was rigged against him from the start, that his good faith meant nothing against corporate convenience. Vivian sank into a nearby chair, her wedding finery incongruous with her distress. I was in college when it happened. I remember asking questions, but father said it was just business, natural market forces. I chose to believe him because it was easier. We all did. Matthew's mother admitted. We all looked away. The revelation settled over the gathering like a heavy blanket. What had begun as whispered scandal about Matthew's unconventional date had transformed into something far more meaningful, a moment of collective reckoning with comfortable lies and calculated indifference. Margaret Wilson's voice cut through the silence. Well, now we know. The question is, what do we do with that knowledge? Rosa carefully returned the documents to her purse. I didn't bring these to demand anything, but maybe knowing the truth can help us all do better. Make different choices. See people as more than numbers on a ledger. The evening light had deepened to purple, and somewhere in the distance, a clock chimed the hour. The wedding reception would soon begin in earnest, but something fundamental had shifted in the atmosphere. The glittering superficiality had given way to something more authentic and uncomfortable, but also more hopeful. Matthew rose slowly from his seat, champagne glass in hand. The murmurs of conversation around the reception hall gradually quieted as guests noticed his stance. The crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow across the gathered faces, some curious, others wary, all waiting. He cleared his throat, his usual confident demeanor softened by the weight of the moment. I'd like to say something, if I may. His voice carried clearly across the room. Many of you came here tonight expecting a certain kind of show. I admit I had my own theatrical intentions. A few nervous chuckles rippled through the crowd. Matthew's gaze found Rosa, who sat with quiet dignity in her simple dress, her hands folded in her lap. But what we witnessed instead was something far more valuable. We saw courage, real courage, not the kind that makes headlines, but the quiet kind that changes hearts. His voice grew warmer, more passionate. Rosa Alvarez didn't come here seeking revenge or trying to shame anyone. She came with truth, yes, but also with grace. Rosa's eyes glistened as Matthew continued. I've spent years in boardrooms and benefit galas, but I've rarely seen the kind of strength she showed today. The strength to face painful history without bitterness. The wisdom to understand that healing starts with honesty. Mrs. Henderson, one of the older board members, dabbed at her eyes with an embroidered handkerchief. Beside her, her husband nodded slowly, his usual stern expression softening. Some of you know Rosa as the woman from the shelter, Matthew acknowledged, but I've seen her work tirelessly to help others, despite her own struggles. I've watched her treat everyone, from CEO to street sweeper, with the same genuine respect. She reminded all of us, what real dignity looks like. Vivian sat very still, her perfectly made-up face showing subtle cracks in its composure. Her new husband squeezed her hand gently. The documents Rosa shared weren't weapons. They were mirrors. They showed us what happens when we prioritize convenience over compassion, when we choose looking away over looking deeper. Matthew's voice grew thoughtful. But they also showed us it's never too late to make different choices. James Wilson stood up then, his distinguished grey hair catching the light. The Wilson Foundation would be honored to establish a workers' relief fund in partnership with the Prescott family. He announced, "It's time we addressed old wrongs." Margaret Wilson nodded firmly. "We'll need someone with both medical experience and a deep understanding of community needs to help coordinate efforts," she added, looking meaningfully at Rosa. More voices joined in. The president of City Memorial Hospital offered to review their community outreach policies. A real estate developer proposed setting aside units in his new housing project for displaced families. Each offer seemed to break down another wall of resistance, another layer of practiced indifference. "This is what change looks like," Matthew continued, his voice warm with emotion. "Not in grand gestures or public announcements, but in small moments of truth and connection, in choosing to see each other as people first, not problems to solve or obstacles to overcome." He turned to face Rosa directly now. "Thank you," he said simply. "Thank you for showing us what grace under pressure truly means. Thank you for giving us the chance to do better." Rosa's eyes shone with unshed tears, but her smile was radiant. Around the room, other eyes grew moist. Even some of the waitstaff paused in their duties, touched by the sincerity of the moment. Vivian suddenly stood up, her movement causing her wedding dress to rustle softly. Her carefully maintained facade cracked completely as she walked over to Rosa. "I'm sorry," she whispered, loud enough for nearby guests to hear. "I'm so sorry for what my family did to yours." Her voice caught. "And I'm sorry I spent so long pretending it didn't matter." The two women looked at each other for a long moment, the society bride and the homeless nurse, connected by a thread of shared history and, perhaps now, shared hope for healing. The atmosphere in the room had transformed. Where there had been judgment and whispered gossip, now there was a tentative warmth. Elderly board members who had earlier turned away from Rosa now approached to introduce themselves. Young socialites who had snickered, behind their hands now, listened intently as she spoke about her work at the shelter. Matthew watched it all unfold with quiet satisfaction. This wasn't the revenge he'd initially imagined when he'd invited Rosa to the wedding. It was something far better, a chance for genuine change, sparked by one woman's courage to stand in her truth with dignity and compassion. The musicians began playing again softly, but the usual artificial gaiety of a wedding reception had been replaced by something more authentic. Small groups formed throughout the room, engaging in real conversations instead of social pleasantries. Plans were being sketched on cocktail napkins, connections made, possibilities explored. Through it all, Rosa remained centered and genuine, responding to each person with the same warm attention she gave to everyone at the shelter. Her presence seemed to remind everyone that true elegance had nothing to do with designer labels or social status. It came from treating others with consistent kindness and respect. Matthew caught glimpses of his mother in deep discussion with hospital board members, her usual social smile replaced by focused determination. He saw Vivian's relatives, who had initially been so dismissive, now listening intently as Rosa described the challenges faced by displaced workers and their families. The evening light softened through the windows, casting a gentle glow over the scene. In that warm illumination, the usual barriers of class and status seemed to matter less. For this moment at least, compassion had prevailed over judgment and hope over history. The morning after the reception dawned cold and grey. Matthew sat at his desk, scrolling through his phone when the first notification hit. His stomach dropped as he saw the headline from the Daily Whisper, "Billionaire's cruel revenge, homeless woman used as pawn in society wedding scandal." The article was a masterpiece of manipulation. His initial meeting with Rosa at the shelter had been twisted into a calculated plot. Anonymous sources claimed he'd spent weeks coaching her to maximize Vivian's humiliation. The reporter had even dug up old quotes from his broken engagement, painting him as a bitter ex determined to ruin Vivian's perfect day. His phone buzzed constantly now. Twitter was exploding with hashtags. Weddinggate and Billionaire revenge trended nationwide. Each refresh brought new waves of outrage. "This is exactly what I was afraid of." His mother's voice crackled through the speaker. "The board is in an uproar. Harrison wants an emergency meeting at 2 o'clock. Matthew's assistant rushed in with printouts from more newspapers. Each headline was worse than the last. Someone had leaked emails between him and his event planner, discussing Rosa's dress and transportation arrangements. Stripped of context, they read like stage directions for a cruel social experiment. Channel 7 is running a special report tonight. His PR director reported grimly. "They're interviewing people who claim they overheard you coaching Rosa before the reception. None of it's true, but—" "Where is Rosa?" Matthew interrupted, his voice tight with concern. No one knew. She hadn't been at the shelter that morning. Her few possessions were gone from her usual spot. The elderly man she'd been caring for said she'd left before dawn. Tears in her eyes. The shelter's phone lines were jammed with reporters. Social media detectives had somehow found Rosa's old nursing license, spreading her personal information across the internet. Cruel memes featuring her face circulated widely. The Prescott family's lawyers are demanding a retraction. His assistant added, looking pale. "They're claiming deliberate emotional distress. Vivian's mother had to be sedated this morning when the story broke." Matthew tried calling Rosa again. Straight to voicemail. He'd left dozens of messages already, each more desperate than the last. "Rosa, please, let me fix this. None of it's true. Please call me back." The board meeting was brutal. Harrison, his senior-most director, slapped down a thick folder of press clippings. "Do you understand what this does to our reputation, to our partnerships? The Wilson Foundation is already reconsidering their commitment to the Workers' Relief Fund." "It's all lies," Matthew insisted, but his voice sounded hollow, even to himself. "The truth doesn't matter anymore." Harrison snapped. "The narrative is set. You used a vulnerable woman to settle an old score. You manipulated public sympathy. You made us all complicit in your revenge scheme." More leaked emails appeared online. Someone had accessed his private calendar, revealing multiple visits to the shelter in the weeks before the wedding. What had been genuine concern was now portrayed as calculated grooming of his unwitting pawn. The shelter's director called, sounding exhausted. "The press won't leave us alone. They're harassing our residents, trying to get dirt on Rosa. Someone spray-painted gold digger on our front wall." Social media influencers picked apart every moment from the reception. Rosa's simple dress was mocked as a calculated costume. Her gentle interactions with guests were labeled as rehearsed performances. Her documented history of nursing was dismissed as an elaborate backstory. Matthew's phone buzzed with a text from Vivian. "I actually believed you'd changed. I thought you really cared about making things right. How could you do this to her?" He wanted to respond, to defend himself, but what could he say? The truth seemed impossibly distant now, buried under an avalanche of speculation and manufactured outrage. The elderly man from the shelter, Mr. Jenkins, somehow got through to Matthew's private line. "She was crying when she left," he said quietly. "Said she couldn't bear bringing shame to the people who'd shown her kindness. said sometimes it's better to disappear than watch good things turn ugly. By evening, the damage was overwhelming. The Daily Whisper published a follow-up piece claiming Rosa had been promised money and connections in exchange for her performance. Anonymous comments flooded news sites, calling her everything from a con artist to a social climber. Matthew's security team reported photographers camping outside his office and home. They'd even found his private lake house, hoping to catch Rosa hiding there. The internet had turned their genuine connection into a tawdry scandal, their moments of truth into calculated theatre. His mother called again, her voice heavy with disappointment. The Foundation's annual gala is next week. The committee thinks it's best if you don't attend. We can't risk any more negative attention. Late that night, alone in his office, Matthew stared at the last photo taken at the reception. Rosa's smile was radiant as she talked with elderly Mrs. Wilson about community healthcare initiatives. Now that moment of authentic connection was tainted, twisted into something ugly by people who traded in scandal and outrage. The shelter's security cameras showed Rosa leaving at 4:30 that morning, a small bag over her shoulder. She'd left a note for Mr. Jenkins, asking him to take care of her few remaining possessions. No forwarding address, no hints about where she might go. On his desk, the morning papers waited with their screaming headlines. His phone continued to buzz with messages from board members demanding action, from reporters seeking comments, from former friends choosing sides. But all Matthew could think about was Rosa walking away in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying the weight of other people's cruelty on her shoulders, her dignity intact even as the world tried to strip it away. Matthew sat in his dimly lit office, ignoring the carefully crafted statement his PR team had prepared. The words rang hollow, empty corporate speak about regrettable misunderstandings and moving forward together. He pushed the papers aside with disgust. "Sir," his assistant Sarah ventured carefully, "the board expects you to make a public statement by noon." "No." Matthew's voice was quiet but firm. "We're done with statements." He pulled up his banking dashboard and began moving money between accounts. His fingers flew across the keyboard with purpose. Sarah watched in confusion as he transferred substantial sums. "Contact Dr. Rivera at Metro Community Hospital," he instructed. "Tell her the funding for that clinic expansion she proposed last year is approved. Full amount. I want construction to begin next week." Sarah blinked. "But sir, the board hasn't—" "It's my personal money," Matthew cut in. "No board approval needed." He was already pulling up another set of documents. "And get me James Chen from the Workforce Development Center." Throughout the day, Matthew methodically redirected his resources. He approved funding for a job training program targeting displaced manufacturing workers. He greenlit 3 affordable housing developments that had been stuck in planning stages. He authorized grants for small business loans in struggling neighborhoods. His phone kept buzzing with messages from board members and PR consultants, all demanding he get ahead of the story. He ignored them all. "Your reputation," Sarah started to say. "My reputation doesn't matter," Matthew interrupted. "What matters is fixing what's actually broken." He thought of Rosa's face when she'd spoken about her father's co-workers, people who'd lost everything when the factory closed. Their suffering hadn't ended with newspaper headlines or corporate statements. It had continued in quiet, grinding ways that no one with power had bothered to notice. By afternoon, he was meeting with Carlos Rodriguez, a former union organizer who now ran a community advocacy group. "These people need real help," Carlos said bluntly. "Not photo ops or promises." "I know." Matthew pushed a folder across the desk. "Here's what I'm proposing. Review it with your team. Tell me what's missing." Carlos's eyes widened as he read through the documents. "This is substantial. It's a start." Matthew corrected. "We'll adjust based on actual needs." He spent hours with Carlos, diving deep into the specifics of what different communities needed most. Job training was crucial, but so was childcare for parents attending classes. Housing assistance needed to include utility support and transportation access. Health services had to account for years of delayed preventative care. The tabloids were still having a field day. New sources emerged hourly with wild claims about his relationship with Rosa. Social media influencers picked apart every interaction they'd had at the wedding. His phone filled with messages from society friends, either condemning him or offering to help manage the situation. Matthew ignored it all. Instead, he met with Dr. Rivera to review clinic staffing needs. He walked through potential sites for the job training center with James Chen. He studied detailed proposals for expanding mental health services and addiction recovery support. "The board is threatening to call an emergency meeting," Sarah reported one evening. Matthew barely looked up from the housing development plans he was reviewing. "Let them." "Sir, they could force you to step down." "Then I'll have more time for this work." He made another note about increasing the number of 3-bedroom units for families. Days passed. While gossip columns speculated about his whereabouts, Matthew worked quietly with community leaders and service providers. He sat in crowded community centers listening to residents describe their needs. He visited shelters, not for photo opportunities, but to understand their capacity issues and funding gaps. Every decision was measured against a simple standard. Would this create real, lasting help for people like those Rosa had known? Would it address the kind of systemic failures that had turned skilled workers and caring professionals into statistics? His mother appeared in his office one morning, elegant as always. "Darling, you have to do something about these headlines. The family name is meaningless if we don't use our resources to help people." Matthew finished. He showed her the plans for the new clinic. "This matters more than our social standing." She studied his face for a long moment. "You really care about her, don't you?" "I care about what she showed me." He corrected. "About the people society finds it convenient to ignore." When his board demanded budget cuts to offset reputational damage, Matthew transferred more of his personal funds to keep projects moving forward. When influential friends hinted they could make the scandal go away, he declined their help and instead asked them to support specific community initiatives. "You can't fix everything," Sarah said gently one late night as Matthew reviewed another proposal. "No," he agreed, "but I can fix some things, real things, and that matters more than any public statement ever could." The work continued quietly, deliberately, focused on creating genuine change rather than managing perceptions. While the media circus raged on, Matthew kept his attention fixed on the tangible ways he could help. One clinic, one training program, one housing unit at a time. It wasn't dramatic or headline-worthy, but with each small step forward, each life potentially made better, he felt closer to honoring what Rosa had shown him about dignity, courage, and the power of choosing to help rather than harm. The morning light filtered through the shelter's windows as Vivian stood hesitantly at the entrance. Her designer coat felt out of place among the worn furnishings and tired faces. Julian squeezed her hand gently. "You're doing the right thing," he murmured. Vivian nodded, her throat tight. The past week had been filled with painful revelations as she'd finally allowed herself to dig through old family records. Each yellowed document had told a story of calculated decisions that had devastated lives like Rosa's family. "Is Rosa here?" she asked one of the volunteers, trying to keep her voice steady. The woman gave her a measuring look. "She's helping in the kitchen." Vivian found Rosa stirring a large pot of soup, her movements precise and practiced. She looked up as Vivian approached, her expression carefully neutral. "Mrs. Harrison?" Rosa acknowledged quietly. This is unexpected. Please, Vivian said, could we talk somewhere private? Rosa wiped her hands on her apron and led them to a small office. The space was cramped but clean, with a desk covered in donation forms and scheduling sheets. Julian positioned himself by the door, a steady presence but giving them space. I've been going through our family archives, Vivian began, her hands twisting together. About the factory closure. About your father. Rosa's face remained composed, but her shoulders tensed slightly. I found letters. Vivian continued. From my father to the board. He knew about the safety concerns, the pension obligations. He had reports showing how many families would be affected. 432. Rosa said softly. That's how many workers lost their jobs, their savings, their homes. Vivian's eyes stung. Yes, and he chose to protect the company's profits instead of helping those families transition. My whole life, I accepted the story that it was just business, that sometimes hard decisions had to be made. Hard for whom? Rosa asked, but there was more sadness than anger in her voice. I was wrong. Vivian whispered. My family was wrong. We had the power to help, and we chose not to use it. We wrapped ourselves in privilege and pretended not to see the damage we caused. Julian moved closer, resting a supportive hand on her shoulder as tears began sliding down her cheeks. My father died believing he'd failed his workers, Rosa said. He'd promised them that if they worked hard, stayed loyal, they'd have security. Instead, they lost everything while the Prescotts got richer. I can't undo what happened, Vivian acknowledged. But I can stop hiding from it. Stop pretending it wasn't our responsibility. She reached into her bag and pulled out a thick folder. This is a proposal. Julian helped me put it together. It's for a foundation, funded by my personal inheritance, focused on supporting displaced workers and their families. Job training, education assistance, housing support, medical care. Rosa took the folder but didn't open it. I'm not asking for forgiveness. Vivian continued. I don't have that right, but I am asking for your help in making sure this actually serves the people who need it. You understand their struggles in a way I never can. Why now? Rosa asked quietly. Because seeing you at the wedding forced me to face what we'd done. And because... Vivian's voice broke. Because I'm tired of being part of the problem, of maintaining an image instead of addressing real pain. Julian spoke up gently. We want to do this right, with real input from the community, real commitment to long-term support. Rosa finally opened the folder, scanning the documents inside. Her expression remained thoughtful as she read. These people aren't charity cases, she said finally. They don't need pity or patronizing assistance. I know, Vivian replied. They need respect, dignity, real opportunities to rebuild what was taken from them. And resources, Rosa added. Access to the kinds of support systems your family has always had. Yes. Vivian met her eyes steadily. Will you help us make sure this foundation provides that? Really provides it, not just as a PR move or tax write-off. Rosa was quiet for a long moment, studying Vivian's face. This won't fix everything, she said finally. Some wounds don't heal completely. I understand. And I'll need time to think about this, to talk to people who were affected. Of course, Julian assured her. Take whatever time you need. The offer will stand. Rosa closed the folder carefully. Thank you for coming, for acknowledging what happened. That matters. Vivian nodded, unable to speak past the tightness in her throat. As they turned to leave, Rosa's voice stopped them. Mrs. Harrison? Vivian looked back. My father always said that true strength isn't in never making mistakes. It's in facing them honestly and trying to make things right. Fresh tears spilled down Vivian's cheeks as she absorbed the words. Together, she and Julian walked out into the morning light, leaving Rosa to consider their offer and the possibility of a different kind of healing. 2 weeks after Vivian's visit, Rosa sat in the small coffee shop near the shelter, her hands wrapped around a warm mug. Across from her, Matthew watched as she carefully reviewed the revised foundation proposal. "The Community Oversight Board is a good addition," she said, turning another page. "And the job training programs. All your suggestions were incorporated," Matthew assured her. Vivian and Julian were very clear about wanting this done right. Rosa nodded, but her expression remained thoughtful. "It's strange," she said softly. "For so long, I carried this weight of what happened. Not just the loss, but the feeling that no one cared, that we were invisible." Through the window, afternoon sunlight caught the silver in her hair. Matthew waited, giving her space to gather her thoughts. "The clinic proposal." She touched the papers gently. "It's exactly what this community needs, but I need to know it won't become another broken promise." "That's why they want you involved," Matthew said. "Your experience as a nurse, your connection to the community, you understand what's really needed." Rosa took a slow sip of coffee. "I told them I'd help," she said finally. "But on my terms, no publicity stunts, no using my story for marketing. And," she straightened her shoulders, "the clinic needs to honor the Alvarez workers, not just my father, but all of them. Their names, their stories need to be remembered." "Of course," Matthew agreed immediately. "What did you have in mind?" "A memorial wall, photos, stories, a record of what they built and what was lost, so people understand this isn't just about charity, it's about recognizing human dignity." Matthew smiled warmly. "I think that's perfect." Rosa's phone buzzed softly. She glanced at it, and her face shifted with emotion. "Speaking of dignity," she took a steadying breath, "my father agreed to meet me. Today." "Hector." Matthew's expression softened with understanding. "How long has it been?" 8 years. Rosa's voice wavered slightly. "After everything fell apart, he couldn't bear to see me struggling, and I couldn't face his disappointment. Do you want me to come with you?" She shook her head. "This is something I need to do alone, but thank you." An hour later, Rosa stood outside a modest apartment building on the east side of town. Her heart hammered as she pressed the buzzer for Unit 3B. The door opened, and there he was. Hector Alvarez looked older, his face more lined, but his eyes were the same. Warm brown, filled with quiet dignity. For a long moment, they just stared at each other. "Rosa," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. "Papa." The word caught in her throat. He opened his arms, and she stepped into them, tears starting to fall as he held her close. His familiar scent, coffee and Old Spice aftershave, brought back a flood of memories. Inside his small apartment, photos covered one wall. Family gatherings, factory celebrations, children's graduations. Rosa recognized faces of people who had worked alongside her father for decades. "You kept them all," she said softly. "To remember." Hector's voice was gentle. "The good and the hard times." They sat at his kitchen table, where 2 cups of coffee waited. Rosa noticed his hands trembling slightly as he added sugar to his cup. "I saw the news," he said carefully. "About the wedding. About what you did." Rosa tensed, but his next words surprised her. "I was proud of you, Mejia, standing up with such grace, such strength. I was so afraid," she admitted, "of causing more pain, of shaming our family name." "Shame." Hector shook his head firmly. "You showed them the truth with dignity, like your mother would have done." At the mention of her mother, Rosa's tears returned. "I'm sorry, Papa, for disappearing, for not letting you help when things got bad. And I'm sorry for letting my pride keep me away." He reached across the table to take her hand. "When I lost the factory, I lost myself for a while. Seeing you struggle." He paused, swallowing hard. "I felt I had failed you as a father." "No, Papa, never that." Rosa squeezed his hand. "You taught me what matters most. Honesty, hard work, caring for others. Even in the shelter, those lessons helped me survive. Help others survive." Hector nodded slowly. "Tell me about your work there." As Rosa described her role at the shelter, the people she helped, Hector listened intently. When she explained about the new clinic project, his eyes grew bright with unshed tears. "This is good work," he said simply. "Healing work." "Will you help?" Rosa asked. "We need people who remember, who can tell the stories that need to be told." Hector was quiet for a long moment. "It still hurts," he admitted, remembering what was lost. "But maybe—" He looked at the wall of photos. "Maybe it's time to use that pain to help others heal too." They talked for hours, sharing memories both painful and precious. When Rosa finally stood to leave, Hector walked her to the door. "Next Sunday," he said hesitantly. "I make dinner, your favorite, arroz con pollo, like your mother's recipe." Rosa's heart swelled. "I'll bring flan," she promised. "The way you taught me." He hugged her again, and this time she felt the years of separation beginning to mend, like broken bones slowly knitting back together. As she walked home through the gathering dusk, Rosa felt lighter. Not because everything was fixed. There were still hard conversations ahead, still wounds that needed time to heal. But she had chosen a path forward that honored both truth and hope, that preserved dignity while making space for change. The lights of the shelter glowed ahead, and she quickened her steps. There was work to be done, stories to be gathered, healing to begin. And this time, she wouldn't be doing it alone. The autumn morning dawned crisp and clear as Rosa stood before the newly renovated clinic building. What had once been an abandoned storefront now gleamed with fresh paint in warm, welcoming colors. The sign above the door read, "Alvarez Community Health Center," in dignified letters. A crowd had gathered for the opening. Shelter residents, former factory workers, medical volunteers, and community members. They clustered together on the sidewalk, their breath visible in the cool air as they chatted quietly. Rosa noticed how naturally they mixed. No invisible lines separating those who had homes from those who didn't. Mrs. Chen from the corner grocery store stood next to Tom, a shelter regular who had helped paint the clinic's walls. A former factory worker who'd lost his pension chatted with a young doctor who'd volunteered her services. This was what healing looked like. Rosa thought. Not just bodies, but a community. Her father stood beside her, his back straight and proud in his best suit. In recent months, he'd become an integral part of the clinic's planning, sharing wisdom gained from decades of managing people and resources. The factory workers respected him, and the medical staff valued his practical insight. "Look at this, Mihija," he whispered, gesturing to the crowd. "Who would have thought?" Rosa squeezed his hand, remembering their Sunday dinners where they'd planned and dreamed, moving from cautious hope to determined action. Each week, more people had joined their vision. She spotted Matthew at the edge of the gathering, deliberately standing back from the cameras. He caught her eye and gave a slight nod. His quiet support had never wavered, but he'd insisted this day belonged to the community. The funds he'd provided came with no naming rights, no corporate branding, just resources to help people heal. A sleek car pulled up, and Vivian emerged with Julian. She wore a simple outfit that wouldn't draw attention, her usual polish tempered by genuine humility. Julian carried their infant daughter in a carrier, the baby's presence a reminder that healing rippled through generations. Vivian approached Rosa, her steps sure but not proud. "The press release is ready whenever you are," she said softly. Julian made sure it focuses on the community's efforts, not our family's involvement. Rosa nodded, appreciating how Vivian had learned to use her social connections to support rather than shield. The younger woman had surprised many with her dedication to making amends, not through grand gestures, but through consistent practical help. "Ladies and gentlemen," the clinic's administrator called out, "if we could gather for the ceremony." The crowd shifted forward. Rosa felt her father's steadying presence as she moved to take her place by the ribbon. The red silk fluttered in the breeze, a bright line between past and future. "Today we celebrate more than a building," Rosa began, her voice clear and strong. "We celebrate the power of community to heal itself." She saw faces in the crowd light up with recognition as she spoke about resilience, about how true healing required both medicine and mercy. A former factory worker wiped his eyes when she mentioned how their stories would be preserved and honored. "In this place," she continued, "we will measure success not in profits, but in people helped, not in money saved, but in dignity preserved." Matthew stepped forward then, handling the large ceremonial scissors to Hector. "Mr. Alvarez," he said formally, "would you do us the honor?" Rosa watched her father's hands that had once operated complex machinery, then weathered years of struggle, grasp the scissors. The ribbon parted with a satisfying snick. Applause erupted as the doors opened. People began moving inside, exclaiming over the bright waiting room with its comfortable chairs and children's play area. Local artists had donated paintings that celebrated the community's diversity and strength. Rosa followed more slowly, taking in details she'd helped plan. Signs in multiple languages, wide doorways to accommodate wheelchairs, a small garden visible through the windows where healing herbs would grow. In the main hallway, a wall of photographs caught the light. There were pictures of the old factory workers, of shelter residents who'd become clinic volunteers, of medical staff training community health workers. Below them, protected behind glass, lay the ledger page that had sparked this change, now accompanied by new pages recording acts of kindness and healing. "It's beautiful," Vivian said quietly, coming to stand beside her. The baby in Julian's arms gurgled, reaching towards the lights. "It's real," Rosa replied. "That's what matters most." She watched as her father led a group of former workers through the facility, pointing out how their suggestions had been incorporated into the design. Their voices carried pride rather than bitterness now. Matthew approached, keeping his customary slight distance. "The board approved funding for 3 more years," he said simply. No strings attached. Rosa nodded, grateful for his understanding that this place needed to belong to the community, not to corporate interests. His money had opened doors, but it was the people's faith and work that would keep them open. The morning continued with tours and celebrations, with stories shared over coffee and pan dulce from the bakery down the street. Rosa moved through it all, noting how naturally people helped each other, offering chairs to the elderly, translating for non-English speakers, guiding newcomers to the right departments. This was the true measure of success, she thought, not the building or the equipment, but the way people looked out for each other, the way hardship had been transformed into help, and old wounds had become sources of strength. The clinic hummed with life and purpose, a testament to what could happen when compassion outweighed pride, when healing meant more than just medicine. It stood as proof that even the deepest hurts could be mended, not by forgetting the past, but by using its lessons to build a better future. The autumn sun slanted through Rosa's apartment windows, painting golden squares on her small but tidy living room floor. She paused in folding laundry to watch leaves dance past her second-floor view. The space wasn't large, but it was hers, a home earned through honest work and restored dignity. Her phone buzzed with a message from the clinic. Another busy day ahead, but she wouldn't have it any other way. The work fulfilled her in ways she hadn't expected when she first accepted the position. Every day brought new challenges and new chances to help others find their footing. Rosa smiled at the framed photo on her wall. The clinic's opening day, with her father standing proud beside her. Hector had found his own path to healing, now serving as a mentor to younger workers in the job training program. His wisdom and experience proved invaluable to those trying to rebuild their lives. The Hector Alvarez Scholarship Fund announcement had arrived yesterday. Rosa knew Vivian was behind it, though the older woman had carefully kept her name off the paperwork. The scholarship would help children of displaced workers pursue medical training, ensuring the next generation had chances their parents didn't. Matthew's foundation had grown in unexpected ways, too. Rather than simply writing checks, they now focused on sustainable community development, using Rosa's approach as a model. 3 new clinics were under construction in other neighborhoods, each shaped by local needs and voices. Rosa gathered her things for work: her ID badge, comfortable shoes, and a small envelope she'd prepared the night before. Inside was enough money for bus fare and a carefully written note. She'd noticed a young woman at the shelter recently, someone who reminded her of herself from not so long ago. The woman had nursing experience but had lost her job after getting sick. Now she was trying to rebuild, just as Rosa once had. The note read, "Sometimes we all need a little help to take the next step. When you're ready, come see me at the clinic. There's always room for one more healer." Rosa slipped into the shelter quietly, nodding to the morning volunteers. She dropped the envelope into the counselor's box, knowing it would find its way to the right hands. The gesture felt right, a small act of mercy that might spark larger change. Walking to work, Rosa passed the old factory building. Its windows were no longer dark. A community center occupied the ground floor now, while upper levels were being converted into affordable housing. Lives were being rebuilt here, brick by brick, and story by story. At the clinic, she found Matthew in the waiting room, his presence as understated as always. He was watching a mother comfort her feverish child, his expression thoughtful. "The pediatric wing opens next month," he said as Rosa approached. "The board's impressed with how you've managed resources here." "The community did the hard work," Rosa replied. "We just gave them tools." Matthew nodded, understanding. His foundation had learned to listen more than direct, to support rather than control. The results spoke for themselves, programs that worked because they grew from real needs and real experiences. Later that morning, Vivian stopped by with donation paperwork. Her designer clothes were as elegant as ever, but she carried herself differently now. Less armor, more awareness. She paused to help an elderly man with his walker before approaching the desk. "Julian says hello," she said warmly. "We're hoping you'll join us for dinner soon. No fancy restaurants. He's cooking at home." Rosa appreciated how Vivian had learned to navigate between her 2 worlds, no longer needing to prove anything to either. The woman who had once feared scandal now spoke openly about second chances and redemption. Through the clinic windows, Rosa could see the shelter where her journey with Matthew had begun. Such a simple building, yet it had sparked changes none of them could have predicted. Lives intertwined, wounds healed, lessons learned about what truly made a person wealthy. She thought of the envelope waiting in the counselor's box. Someone would find it today, just as others had found help when they needed it most. The cycle would continue. Mercy given freely, dignity restored carefully, hope passed forward one small gesture at a time. In the end, That was the real measure of wealth, not in bank accounts or social standing, but in moments of kindness that rippled outward, touching life after life. Rosa had learned this truth in poverty and carried it into abundance. Now she watched it multiply as others caught the vision of counting riches in acts of compassion rather than dollars. The morning's first patients began arriving, and Rosa turned her attention to the work at hand. There were people to help, stories to hear, healing to facilitate. This was where true wealth lived, in the space between giving and receiving, in the quiet moments when humanity recognized itself in the eyes of another.